Happy New Year! It's the week ending Saturday the 7th of January 2023, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen hundreds of thousands of people gathering in Rome for the funeral of Pope Benedict XVI, the arrest in Romania of self-proclaimed misogynist and online influencer Andrew Tate, and after 7 long years, Happy Valley returning to British TV for a third and final series. You can read more about all of that in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Julia O'Driscoll. From Daily Podcast Today and History with the Retrospectors, it's Arion McNicoll. And from the endless vortex of her own social media consumption, it's writer and comedian Suchandrika Chakrabarti. Julia, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is £1,000,000 enough money to tempt Tokyo residents to move?
I mean, in the beginning, we used to go to Tokyo a lot more because we weren't really used to this life here yet. But then time passed and, we didn't want to go in anymore.
In the beginning, we were going to Tokyo 2 to 3 times a week.
Yeah.
And then it became once a week, and then maybe once or twice a month. And now it's I think we've gone in once or twice this year. Since COVID happened.
Vice Asia's 2020 documentary, Japan's Country Towns Were Dying Then COVID Happened. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube. Julia, what's happened this week?
So the Japanese government has announced that it's going to more than triple the amount of money that residents in Tokyo can receive for choosing to leave the big city and move to more rural regions. So this scheme first began back in 2019, and the government are trying to tackle this massive population imbalance basically between the rural regions, which have far fewer people, and the populations are also aging, and the cities where they're obviously highly populated and attract a lot of younger people, and there's a lot more wealth as well. So they've started in 2019 by offering families with children 300,000 yen per child to move and start a new life out in the countryside. And they have announced in the past week that they are going to up that money to 1,000,000 yen per child.
Okay. So how much is 1,000,000 yen?
So it's about £6,300.
Okay, so just under 13 grand if you've got 2 children then. I'm just working out what I'd get if I moved to rural Japan. That's 13 grand per year, is it?
I think it's just a one-off payment, but if you also agree to certain conditions around your work, so either joining a local business, continuing your work remotely, or starting a new business in the area, you can get another 1,000,000 yen. So it's actually about £20,000 total if you have 2 kids.
Okay, which is a nice amount of money, Arion, but it's kind of like, an annual salary, isn't it, in a modest job? But you have to do it for 5 years before you get to keep it. You have to stay in this rural area for 5 years. It doesn't seem like quite enough to uproot your entire family to rural Japan.
I completely agree. And I was trying to think through what I would be making of this offer if I was a Japanese person living in a big city centre. And I'd be thinking 2 things. One, exactly what you've run through, which is that it just doesn't add up economically in terms of, wanting to restart a whole life in a completely different part of the country. But 2, as Julia was saying, the country has just upped the amount that they're offering by from whatever it was, 300,000 yen to 1,000,000 yen in a single year. So I think, if I was living in Tokyo or Yokohama or somewhere else, I might be thinking, well, hang on, I hold out for a little bit longer and see what the government has to offer me next year.
Yeah, the 2025 offer, 4,000,000 yen, then I'll do it.
Exactly. But I do think that it's part of a broader problem that the country is facing, which is this issue of too many people in the big city centres and too few people out in the countryside. And it faces this very unusual problem in terms of a major economy, which is that they actually have too many houses rather than too few, which is the story in so many parts of the world, including the UK. And so they're kind of trying to fill those houses with people who are struggling to find places that could actually fit a family in one of those big cities because there's all of this unoccupied housing stock.
To flip it on its head, though, as well, Suchandrika, I wonder if the failure of this policy so far isn't necessarily about the unattractiveness of rural Japan. It might just be about the particular appeal of Tokyo, which is one of the world's great global cities, isn't it? Of course, young people want to live there.
Well, it's such a lifestyle change, right? We've heard loads of stories of people who moved out of the cities in the pandemic. It's my favourite story I love to bring usually. And like you've got to drive, for instance, whereas you don't have to do that in a big city where you've got public transport. That changes everything. What's the situation with the schools? What is happening with work? If you have to be in the office once or twice a week, then suddenly you've got a 2 hour long commute maybe, and that changes things, especially if you've got childcare and picking them up. So I don't think it's taking those things into account. What is the infrastructure out there? I'm guessing it's not very appealing because this hasn't been taken up as an offer all that much. Also, like Japan is an expensive country. It sounded like not very much to begin with, that offer. And as you've said, it's kind of going up and up. And it would make you think, give it a couple of years and see how desperate the government is now.
Yeah, well, I suppose also that demographic split is kind of awkward, isn't it, Julia? You know, I suspect most kind of young professionals, if you ask them, what kind of people would you like to live among in terms of their age group? They'd probably either say a wide spread of demographics, old people, young people, middle-aged people, or they'd say people like me. They probably wouldn't say, I'd like to be the only young couple in a town full of 80-year-olds.
Yeah, it's so true. It'd be such a massive lifestyle change. And I was thinking as well that if you're a family who the parents are quite happy to move out and take this money, when the kids get to 18, they might decide that actually they want to go back to the big city anyway. So really, in the long term, I don't know if this is really a sustainable initiative.
Okay, well, let's talk about, the mechanics of it then. The kind of pull rather than push, I suppose. Does incentivizing people through bribes work generally?
Well, for one thing, Japan isn't the only country to have tried something like this. Areas of Switzerland and Australia and Italy and Spain and Portugal and Ireland have all done a fairly similar thing. In 2017, the Swiss region of Albanen, for instance, offered $25,000 per adult for anyone who would be willing to move to a village and build or refurbish a home. And I think that is probably, like, that scheme in particular offers an example of how to make this work in the longer term. That what you want is not for people to just kind of move there for a short period, but actually set up shop and establish a new life in a new part of the country. And, Japan has a particular problem. Like, the reason that it has this housing stock out in the countryside is that in the 20th century, there were these two major population spikes. The first was after World War II, and the second was after the economic explosion of the 1980s. And both created a housing shortage that then led to the erection of this, like, massive, cheap, mass-produced housing out in the countryside that actually weren't very nice. And I think to a lot of people in Japan, it probably doesn't look very tempting because the houses on offer actually aren't that lovely. So it would be about like completely demolishing the place and starting again. And I think you'd also, I suppose, as Suchandrika was saying, you'd want to know that there is a community to move into. You don't just want to be on your own. You want to be among fellow people with like-minded ideas and kids at the same age and all of that. So I think that idea that Switzerland had of trying to establish communities through these incentives is what other countries should potentially try to pursue if they want to do the same thing.
Do you think the major factor is the aging population, Julia, behind this? It's not really about city and country. It's just that everyone's getting older.
I think it does come down to that. Japan's population has been shrinking by hundreds of thousands of people every year for a number of years. And the number of children in Japan reached its lowest level since 1950 last year, which was quite a shocking fact when I read it. And I think it is part of a global trend. Like, Japan is not an anomaly in this. The birth rates are falling in developed countries globally. But Japan particularly, I thought it was really interesting. The kind of factors behind that are more women in the workforce and not necessarily choosing to get married and then have children, kind of choosing different life roles to that might have traditionally been available. And a BBC report said that Japan has one of the highest levels of women in the workplace, higher than the US, which I thought is something that actually I hadn't really realised, but it does make a lot of sense as to why this is such an acute problem in Japan particularly.
Because an obvious solution might be migration, right? I mean, there are plenty of people, I'm sure, in Vietnam and Thailand and other countries nearish there who would love to come and work there. So
as Arion mentioned, various other countries in Europe have also run schemes to incentivize people. And I always think of the ones you see often pop up on social media. It's like this gorgeous Italian village will pay you 20,000 euros to move here and set up shop. And in that case, they're obviously, even the fact it's being targeted through social media, it is appealing to a very like to an overseas audience, I think, and lots of Brits and Americans who are thinking, oh, actually, yeah, that sounds really appealing.
But probably not Africans that they're targeting, right? I mean, that's what I'm getting at. I mean, the Japanese clearly have chosen not to welcome in people that are ethnically different to them. That is part of what's going on, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's true. And Japan is famously difficult to break into. Like, welcoming to foreigners, it's easy to have a very sort of nice encounter with polite people on the street. But I've got a mate who moved from Australia to Japan, and it took him a long time to really feel as though he had properly been accepted into the sort of the area of Tokyo that he was living in. And I think that is because of that traditional Japanese monoculture that has been preserved for such a long time for various quite complex historical reasons. But I think that even to this day, it just isn't the most welcoming of places for new arrivals, and it takes a long time before you're likely to be able to break into it. So this is a policy that's being kind of targeted at Japanese people, not at kind of, people coming from overseas to fill this empty housing stock.
Suchandrika.
So yeah, I found a sort of success story from 2019. So this is a CNN report, and it's a place called Nagi in Japan, Nagi. And basically that is a kind of agricultural town, emptied out as people moved to the city, and they started paying people living there to have children, essentially. But what they did was make it a very family-friendly place to live as well. So they've got a population of 6,000. It's a tiny place. Families receive 10,000 yen payments. That's $879. I don't have the pounds, unfortunately. For their first child, 150,000 yen for their second, and up to 400,000 for their fifth child. Again, this is the 2019 numbers. Fifth child, that is truly something. But they also have lots of perks as well. So it's not that sense of like, oh, I'm moving out to the countryside and it's just me and lots of people who are unlike me. Because what people with small children need is other families with small children around, right? And they need facilities for those kids as well, things to keep them busy, places where they'll be safe. So Nagi has subsidised housing, free vaccinations, school allowances, reduced nursery costs. That's a big one. Really high childcare costs in the UK are a huge problem. And most people in the neighbourhood have 2 or 3 children or more because they can, and because the town has been built for that particular purpose. So I think part of the job the government needs to do as well is showcase the fact that they've made these places sort of child and family friendly too. And I'm not sure if they've done that as part of this scheme.
I think that's right. That is one of the things that young families want. But I think, we often talk about this show identifying stories that could have repercussions for all of our lives. And I think that this is a conversation that's going on internationally of people contemplating really properly for the first time the idea that they might want to move out of the big city and to a regional area where they can continue to do their work, because we have all had it proven to us that a lot of jobs can be done remotely. But I think there still is a great sense of apprehension among a lot of workers that even if they're working for a company that's willing to allow them to go somewhere else, it limits them in 2 ways. Either you're tied to that company and you can't, then shop around because the next company that you work for may not be so willing to have you working from, Cardiff instead of London or whatever. And also that even if the company that they're working for does have that policy at this moment, it could change it at any time. And so that's a risk as well. So I think that's why a lot of people who would actually quite like to move out of the big city still feel apprehensive about it. It's not just that there's no sort of common shared experience of like-minded people with young families. It's that they're still ambitious professionally and they may not be able to continue their jobs if they move out of the big town.
Yes. A complex and contemplative conversation with nuance, perhaps undermined by the Mail Online headline for this story, "Honey, I sold the kids." So Chandrika, you're up next after this. Okay, so Chandrika, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
Should right-wing political parties worry about becoming obsolete?
Those currently aged between 26 and 41, as this group has got older, they've actually become significantly less right-wing, with millennials today about 15% less conservative than the national average. Far, far more left-wing than the older generations were by this phase of their life. But that makes some sense, right? This generation has grown into political maturity through a very different and difficult time. They've seen the recession of 2008, continued economic issues, and deepening political crises. As a result, they've become significantly less able to purchase their own homes, and partially as a result of that, they've become less likely to have children of their own. With these ties to conservatism weakening, this generation is seemingly becoming less aligned from the political expectations.
TLDR News' YouTube channel reporting on Wednesday. Suchandrika, what's the story?
So if you've been reading the Financial Times, you might be surprised to find out that right-wing political parties should be worried. So there was a column by their chief data reporter, John Byrne-Murdoch, a journalist who loves a graph, if you follow him on Twitter. And he said that he's crunched the numbers and he's found that Western conservatives are at risk from generations of voters who are no longer moving to the right as they age. And the first of those generations, of course, millennials. I think quite a lot of us are in that particular cohort. So it's a political truism that we get more conservative as we get older. But today's millennials in both Britain and the US are by far the least conservative 35-year-olds and above in recorded history. That's particularly the age where you're meant to go, do you know what? Liz Truss is right. So the most likely explanation is a cohort effect. It's that the millennials we've developed different values to previous generations because we've had unique experiences. Some of them have been talked about in that video, but also education and in particular higher education is important.
So do you believe that? Do you believe the reason that millennials are less right-wing than the prior generation at the age they are now is because of what they've experienced, or do you think it's to do with the state of politics?
Oh, it has to be both. And I think when we talk about experience, it's not just like the 2008 crash, 2016 Brexit vote, those things. I think it's also that 50% of young people should be going to university. That was New Labour back around the time I was going to university, which was great for those 50% possibly, but also it did beg the question, what did the other 50% do? And so I think often they can be looking for direction from politics, whereas there tends to be a correlation between a university education and leaning more left-wing. So that could say something about this generation in particular. What Byrne-Murdoch was looking at in terms of the data, by the way, just to make that very clear, he was looking at the British election study, which is data going back 50 years, so back to the 1964 election. He was looking also at American data, so the US General Social Survey and American National Election Studies. And what he's really finding is that this is a trend across the US and Britain, that millennials are not following our baby boomer parents, and also Gen X as well, into kind of going towards the right as we go into our middle, not quite twilight years yet.
And Arion, if you were, like so many of your Australian counterparts, advising the Conservative Party on their media strategy, would you be saying they need to be paying attention to this? Is this a serious problem? Because it's not even the next generation of voters, is it? It's going to be like the bulk of voters aren't going to be boomers next time. They're going to be millennials.
I think it is definitely worth paying attention to. And as Suchandrika was saying, the graphs in particular are intensely eye-catching because you look at it and you just see this very clear line of every generation heading towards conservatism except for millennials. It's too early to say what Gen Z is going to do, but the millennial line was this straight curve downwards towards liberalism rather than conservatism. And I think that would make any political analyst sit up and take notice. But I did think that there was a little bit of tangled thinking in what John Byrne-Murdoch was trying to say, because he, as you were saying, Suchandrika, was trying to attribute this lack of conservatism in millennials to the cohort effect, which is just that they think differently, as opposed to either the age or period effects he was talking about. Age is just when you get older, you think differently as you get older, or period effects are moments in time that affect generations equally, where, we all witness September 11 or we all witness global financial crisis or whatever. But when he started to dig into what had caused the cohort of millennials to have the views that they have, he did point to both the global financial crisis and Brexit in the UK, or the election of Trump in the US, as being political moments that really affected millennials' thinking. And what I couldn't quite work out was why that wouldn't be something that would affect all of the generations equally. And for me, at least, again, if I'm to come back to your question about what my advice would be if I was a conservative political strategist, I think I'd be concerned about the drop-off in positivity towards conservatism generally. And so I think that's where the Conservatives need to be concerned is that, like in the UK and the US and elsewhere, people are really moving away from voting for right-wing parties in a way that even just 10 years ago they were heading towards.
Yeah, I mean, here in the UK, Julia, the problem for the Conservatives would be that it's almost as if the millennial cohort that are about to vote in great numbers would be ready for David Cameron now. And instead, they've moved right of that over the last 10 years. And they're now well away from a party that could, for example, go into coalition with the Liberal Democrats.
Yeah, I think that is very true. I was thinking about it in terms of like, is this, within the last 12 months, obviously we can look at the Conservative Party and see why lots of people would turn away from them now. But as John Byrne-Murdoch points out, this was happening before Liz Truss. We can think before Boris Johnson and Partygate. And I was thinking about the NHS crisis in particular and how just before Christmas, there was a government commissioned report by the King's Fund, which found that a decade of neglect and underfunding is what has led to the NHS crisis that we're seeing now, which obviously is fairly embarrassing for the government. It's a government commission report, and they're saying that 10 years of Tory underfunding is what has led to that. So I think it would be easy to kind of pin it on these more recent headlines and events that were impossible to miss. But actually, if I think back on like the last 10 years, which is the 10 years that I've been able to vote, what has really shaped my political views are things like, the NHS crisis, the housing crisis, but also big things like Brexit. And, at the end of the day, it's the Conservative Party that have been in power overseeing all of those things. So I think it's understandable that would have an impact on voting intention.
So there's the NHS. The other kind of hot button issue, and this is one I know that you care about a lot, Suchandrika, is home ownership. I don't have the exact stats to back this up, but I'm sure it's a fair guess to say that over the last 100 years, if you polled 35-year-olds, more of them would own their own home than now. That must change whether you are leaning Conservative, at least with a small c.
I don't know. I don't own a home.
Well,
but
exactly.
What I would say is that we're kind of underestimating as well how much the internet has changed and given us what we have now is a sharing economy. So there isn't just like one life path of like, right, better get married, better be in a heteronormative relationship, better have kids right now, got to own that house. You can be a digital nomad. You can travel the world with your laptop and have a career. You can go and live in other countries. That list has shrunk since 2016, but you can still do that. You can get like a digital nomad visa in like Bali, and that can look very attractive in January. So there are other ways to live, and millennials are not yet at that age where necessarily their health might be an obstacle to travel. So they can still be doing that in their late 30s, 40s. I think the oldest millennials are in their 40s. So I suppose there are other kind of paths we can follow, and the internet has shown us that it's possible. We can look on Instagram and see a dream life that looks different to the ones that maybe our parents said were the only ones to live. Some of our parents, not all of them.
That's a good point, but so many people do still want to own their own home that if the Conservatives were able to do what Thatcher did in the 80s and make people feel like that was a possibility, that would surely swing more people more right, wouldn't it?
Possibly, yes, but we're looking at sort of 40 years of the dismantling of the welfare state, which is now resulting in A&E delays causing 500 deaths a week, ambulances taking 16 hours to get to people. And I think that's what's really hitting with our generation, is that the people who are taking this stuff away from us, it feels like personal. They had all this. They were bathing in socialism their entire lives. They had ambulances that turned up and actually were able to get to people, to save them. And we're not living in that country anymore, and we're asking why, and hopefully we're going to start voting along with those feelings. But it's really that dismantling the state, which started with Thatcher, has been going on for so long now that it's reached such a desperate end game here that we voted for Brexit. £350 million could have gone from the EU back to the NHS according to that bus, but actually what we've got is this huge crisis that we talk about so much. It's not even in the headlines because it's every day it's the same story. So yeah, I think our generation is going, why can't we have those things that we grew up with, and that sense of security and stability in one of the world's richest countries?
And again, generationally, there's that interesting tension, isn't there, Arion? We're taxing the working young to pay for benefits that are actually still being enjoyed to a large extent by the boomer generation that do own their own homes and actually have pensions going up with inflation, etc.
Yeah, which is the case in every generation. But I think that if you attach that to the kind of insecurity that Suchandrika is talking about and that you're talking about, Olly, I think that is probably a good summation of at least one of the things that's powering this story. And the Telegraph had a piece where they said, basically, let's see how millennials feel after they inherit their parents' expensive properties and see whether that changes their view on, say, for example, the redistribution of wealth from richer people to poorer people. I don't think that that's necessarily correct. I think that, there's every chance that that millennials will remain more left-wing and left-leaning than previous generations.
And to be clear, I mean, this more left-wing thing, I mean, really, it's centrism, isn't it? Like, it's not as if everyone's going into rabid socialism, right? It's just they haven't swung the way of the Conservatives.
I think that's a really important point. And if you look at even the politics in the US, which this article was trying to talk about together, it was lashing the US and the UK to one another as if this is a single story. But, the Democrats in the US are not a very left-wing party. So, to support the Democrats doesn't make you a sort of a socialist. And I think that probably even in the UK, part of the crisis in conservatism here is to do with the fact that the party has been whiplashing around in so many directions. I mean, if you try to draw a through line between Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss and Sunak, like what do they actually stand for? I think part of why so many people in the UK might be shifting away from that party is that it's kind of, a party that's been in power for such a long time that not even your standard conservative who supported Cameron in those early years of this period of conservative Tory rule would necessarily find that they support the Truss period, for example.
In general, when it comes to these groupings, Julia, do you think they are that useful anyway? I'm talking about, Gen Z, Gen X, Millennial, because... So I was born in 1981, which makes me, I think, a geriatric millennial. You were born in 1994, and yet you're in the same demographic as me. Do you think that's right? I mean, it's not just politics that's moving quickly. It's also attitudes within age bands, isn't it? That's a broad group.
Yeah, it is a really broad group. I guess, if you're happy to identify as a geriatric millennial, then I'll be a baby millennial and everything's fine. I think that is a good point. But then when we're talking about these kind of major events that have taken place in the last 10 years and then have knock-on consequences for years and years, I think it is helpful to think about kind of a grouping in that sense. But it does seem quite broad. And I would say, I would almost like those graphs to have kind of subsections in it of actually, it would be really interesting once we also have Gen Z to add into the formula as well.
Well, do you think this is a permanent change? Or do you think this is going to swing back? And do you think it is possible that Gen Z might start voting more right-wing when they're 35?
Well, I was reading a piece by Professor Ben Ansell at the University of Oxford. He's a political scientist, and it was his data that was drawn on in part in the FT analysis. And one of his points, after a lot of even more graphs, if you're a graph fan, he said that, at the end of the day, the Conservatives have really mastered the art of straddling divides to win elections. And, we really saw that with Johnson in 2019 winning over Red Wall support. So I think it's going to be a case of whether actually the party does sit up and pay attention and kind of pivots and adapts. And I think at this point, not just throw out a few policies that are going to keep people happy. It needs to be done with long-term intention to win people over. So really going to hinge on that.
Okay, Arion, you're up next after this. Okay, Arion, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, Sweden enacted a national policy to quite literally keep the wolf from the door.
So if you're a crop farmer in Sweden, maybe you should be getting up in arms over this. It's very transparent why this policy passed in the first place. It's because the policymakers are very out of touch with nature and science, but very in bed with the hunting lobbyists. Many trophy hunters see this as a masculine pursuit, their domination over nature. Why don't you try and dominate your new PB in the bench press, bro? You're kind of lacking recently. If you live in Sweden or Norway and want to try and make a difference and stop the cull that is going on right this second, please contact your local political representative. I will now go put my shirt back on.
It's not often a topless man tells me that. I think I should alert our audio audience that he was. Scott Pye there, a.k.a. Nature's Temper on TikTok. There you are. That's how to reach the millennials. Arion, what is the politics that he was discussing there without his shirt on?
So on Monday this week, he was discussing the fact, without his shirt on, that Sweden kicked off what's being called the largest wolf cull in modern times. And hunters in the 5 Swedish counties with the most wolves, I won't even attempt to pronounce them, will be allowed to kill a total of 75 wolves. And that may not sound like very much, but it represents nearly a fifth of the country's critically endangered wolf population, which stands at around 460 wolves currently. So consequently, many environmentalists are pretty concerned, and some say that the move could have grave consequences, particularly for biodiversity.
What's the counter-argument? Because, I mean, of course, animal lovers are going to be concerned about a cull of wolves, but why is there an argument that there should be a cull of wolves?
Yeah, the counter-argument is, well, there are several things that people point to. Safety concerns. Some people are worried about apex predators attacking humans, impact on livestock. People who advocate for culling wolves and bears and lynx in Sweden say that it's important so that farmers don't have a rough time with different animals taking their livestock. And then there's these sort of economic costs, I guess, just the sort of pure money involved in the process of trying to both rewild wolves, as it's called, when you try to, reintroduce a species that used to live in a country, and then maintain them in ways that then, for people who are concerned about it, don't threaten human populations.
And the campaigners say, Suchandrika, that it's not a fair fight between the two sides on this debate, because one of the articles I read said that there is apparently like a kind of hunting lodge under the Swedish parliament. They literally have guns there and a hunting association, which I don't know. I sort of assume that kind of thing happens in the House of Commons, but does actually slightly bias a debate, doesn't it?
That says so much more about Britain than anywhere. We're just like, we just assume everyone else has got people who hunt for sport. We're like, yeah, it seems about right. And I think it's quite nice to almost read that Swedish people maybe think it's not great. I mean, you're not getting a sense this is hunting for sport in any way whatsoever. But I was struggling to find a really strong reason for why they're doing it. It does seem as though Sweden's kind of caught between its own traditions of kind of being okay with a large number of wolves being around, but there's an EU Species and Habitats Directive which says that they should be keeping the population towards the bottom of the 170 to 270 range.
I think what that EU directive is driving at is that that's a minimum for a species to be able to survive, and that range of 170 to 270 is really what at least some scientists think is like the sort of lowest end of the spectrum to be able to have wolves continue as a species without interbreeding starting to cause genetic problems. So, I think that the pressure is coming internally from, as you were suggesting, Olly, this sort of the power of the hunting lobby in Sweden. And the EU directives are the things that are slightly holding back the hunting lobby from being able to take out as many wolves as they want.
I'm really interested about that sort of hunting culture in Sweden, though, Julia, because I guess, when we talk about Sweden here in Britain, it's normally, if you think back to the conversation we were just having, it's normally in the context of, well, they're a more liberal country. They tend to be more progressive on lots of their politics. They have more benefits for people, et cetera, et cetera. But that is kind of about the big cities, isn't it? And out in the sticks, where you still have a lot of farmland and a lot of snow and a lot of wolves, you do have a lot of people with guns that want to kill those wolves. And actually, we don't talk a lot about that, but that's an integral part of what makes Swedish society too, those rural communities.
Yeah, I think so. I was reading on a website that was something like facts about Swedish wolves, which I can recommend, that Sweden's had wolves for hundreds of years. Hunting them has been an integral part of rural life for years and years. And there were probably thousands up until the 1700s. But there was then this kind of switch in culture and attitudes where the wolf population got so big that there was a loss of livestock, deer and moose. So that's the other thing, is that hunting moose is a really prized activity in Sweden. And so I think there's this concern now that if the wolf population grows, then that could then be under threat as well.
But there's something sexy about wolves, isn't there, Suchandrika, from both sides of this, I feel. For people who like hunting, that's a big prize. And for people who are anti-hunting, they're such beautiful, charismatic animals. But I was reading, actually, boars are probably more of a problem than wolves. You don't get this fuss about badgers in Sweden.
No, Brian May has not been involved at all with this, as far as I can tell. But I wonder as well if climate change will affect their habitat as well. Like we had the story over the New Year of the walrus that turned up in Scarborough and they couldn't have the fireworks. And you're getting sort of animals turning up in places where usually the climate would suggest they don't belong and they don't have food there and they couldn't survive there. So I'm wondering if that's something that's happening, that the wolves are wandering to areas they weren't before. And if it isn't happening now, it probably will happen in the future. And that puts farmers and their livestock and just people living their lives at greater risk, I suppose, if those wolves can sort of get closer to their homes. So that's something to think about for the future, I suppose. But yeah, do you feel like people are more up in arms about wolves than they are about badgers and other less exciting animals? I hope that isn't true.
In Sweden, that appears to be the case. Arion?
Yeah, well, I think that is always a thing that meets resistance, even in places that are pro-rewilding efforts. And, in the UK, for example, there's quite a lot of rewilding that's going on, including in the Knepp Wildland Project, which is a place in West Sussex, which is trying to just restore the land to a more natural state. And that has promoted a number of species, including nightingales and turtle doves and purple emperor butterflies and so on. Then there's the Beaver Trust that, as you might expect, is trying to reintroduce beavers as a form of natural flood management. But I think that the part of the argument that tends to get a bit spicy is where people talk about bringing wolves back to the UK. And I think a lot of people have an inherent concern that the wolves are going to come and get them. And, the problem is, at least for people who advocate for rewilding projects, is that if you are going to be comprehensive in returning an area of your country to the state in which it was prior to humans turning up, you do need to have those apex predators because they're part of that complex story. And so,
and they're not generally literally coming for babies, are they? I mean, that's the thing. People get scared, but the statistics on wolves attacking humans, they might go after humans' pets, chickens, rabbits, cats, but they're not going to come for your kids, no?
That's right. And if you look at in Sweden in particular, there was actually this freak killing spree that happened in the 1820s where a wolf that had been unnaturally domesticated, taken into someone's home and then released, started attacking people. It actually attacked 31 people and killed 12 of them. And that kind of lived long in the Swedish memory and was part of the reason why, for a period, the country was very happy to kill off a lot of wolves. And that continued until the 1960s when they had just 10 wolves left and returned to a policy of trying to make sure they didn't kill off their entire wolf population. But I think, in answer to your question, you're absolutely right. Wolves don't naturally tend to attack people.
Just on the point of needing these predators, I was reading a piece about boars in Scotland this week and how actually the reintroduction of wild boars has been great in terms of biodiversity. And it just made me think more broadly. So often when we talk about biodiversity, we're talking about bees and insects and wildflowers, and it's this very pretty flora and fauna kind of idyllic thing. And actually it's these kind of conversations about, we do need predators, otherwise that biodiversity can't move the whole way up the ecosystem, and that's when it can really start to impact humans as well. So it kind of needs this bigger shift in the conversation.
I didn't know that bison had been reintroduced to the UK. They've been hunted to extinction 12,000 years ago, but they started roaming on British soil again. They've been reintroduced, and they've had positive effects, they do grazing and eating bark and bathing in dust, and they can help restore the biodiversity of the landscape, and it's helpful for climate change as well. So these are kind of quite small changes that can then have a chain reaction that can help with the problems that human beings have introduced to the planet. So there can be some really good effects of rewilding.
Good factoid. You truly are the apex predator of information. Suchandrika, thank you. Arion, Julia, thank you. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription. Just go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.